Thank you everyone for joining us. I am Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of openDemocracy, the global news website. I'm really delighted to be joined today by an absolutely fantastic panel. The title of this discussion is Vaccine Fear, How Conspiracy Theories and Alternative Facts Make Us Sick. And we're going to be hearing from Nguyen, who is joining us from the World Health Organization, and Jon Roozenbeek, who is joining us from the University of Cambridge, and Chamila Liyanage, who's a specialist on terrorism and political violence at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, which is one of openDemocracy's partners. We thought that we would kick off this discussion by asking Tim what his job is, what he does every day, because I think that will give us an overview of what we're going to be talking about in many ways for the next hour. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. There were some really fantastic questions, and we'll come to a lot of them. And you can also add questions or add comments in the chat or via Facebook, and it'll get fed back to me. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining. And we'll start by Tim telling us what he does every day.
Thank you, Mary, for putting this panel together. I'm very happy to be here. What I'm doing every day since 1st of January 2020. So almost 13 months now into this global epidemic, pandemic, as we call it now. I think since then, I'm part of the WHO response for the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are different technical areas we cover. And one of these technical areas that I lead on is the pillar we call infodemic management, risk communication, and community engagement. And I think this word infodemic is the new concept we have seen, and this phenomenon we have seen now, starting with this pandemic, about too much information in the information ecosystem. And we say some good and some not so good. And I think we are talking about the not so good one as well today, but I think it's very important that we look at both sides. We have an obligation also to provide the information ecosystem with good advice, with good information, so people see and find those, and that we don't creating information voids where the bad information kicks in, where then there's a playground for individuals or small groups really to fill with wrong information that then others can read. So I think when we're talking about fighting misinformation, conspiracy theories, it's always both sides. And I'm very much also advocating that it's not always about fighting and correcting misinformation, but also equally filling the information ecosystem with authoritative, with advice that people understand. And I think that's the other concept that's very important. We often come from a scientific point of view and trying to explain scientifically, reaching hopefully the ratio, the logical thinking of people, but people deciding by heart and by out of their stomach. And we need to learn also to translate our evidence and our guidance in a way that reaches people's hearts and feelings. And I think that's, I see the core of my job, translating that evidence into something people can act upon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I wanted to get some very basic questions out of the way first, because I think it's very important, journalistically to do so. We've had questions such as, is there a potential health danger from the COVID vaccine? Any of them? Will it be effective against the new strains? In Britain, they decided to delay the second dose. Is it true that FDA staff in the US can earn money from the vaccines they regulate? Just if you could address those just sort of first principles questions, I think that would be great grounding for this discussion.
There were several questions at the same time. I might not have picked all of them, so let me try to recoup with the first one. Is the vaccine safe? I think the most important thing is I will take it myself if it's my turn. I'm still on the younger side, so I'm not in that age group and risk group yet that would receive it first, but most importantly, I will take it myself, and I cannot wait for it to get it. So if that's hopefully answers the question, is it safe? Of course, It has gone through all the regulatory processes. It has been reviewed by several medicines agencies about their safety profiles. There's a lot of research and academics that have published the safety and the effectiveness of this. And I myself trust this, and I will take the vaccine myself. I think that's the most important thing, how I judge and hopefully, transmit, that this is a safe vaccine.
So you've just demonstrated the communications practice there, right? Which is, not just facts and figures and data, but talking about something that touches people, that's human.
Good. And if I have the other questions, can FDA staff earn money from this? I don't know FDA staff, but I would assume that in the FDA, same as most public institutions, there are safeguards in place that you don't invest in certain areas that you are actually researching in. I think there are ethical principles. I myself, as a WHO staff, have to sign and submit every year to our ethics office that I don't hold stocks in pharmaceutical companies, or my family member works for this and this. So there are safeguards in place that there is no undue influence of the industry on the decision making we do as a public health official and civil servant. And I'm pretty much sure that at the FDA side, those colleagues are also have to do this ethical conduct. I cannot talk on behalf of FDA people because I'm a WHO staff.
Thank you very much. So there's another question which I wanted to put to a couple of the other panelists as well, which is, what is a conspiracy theory? How do you define it? What's the difference between healthy skepticism and conspiracy theories? Is there a danger in kind of lumping these two things together, and where do they overlap? But Chamila, I wanted to ask you that first from the perspective of your own research on far right movements and other sort of aligned movements, and then Jon, I wanted to ask you the same question.
When it comes to, I think, conspiracy theory, it's a wider narrative. I think one participant and one person asked, can I trust Pfizer? Yeah, that's, I think, healthy skepticism. But again, if you evolve the narrative to say that Pfizer is part of a globalist depopulation plan, then it will become a conspiracy theory. That's what I think, because you must go into a kind of area that you really can't touch by your sensory experience, because your sensory experience is the way we find evidence and prove evidence and define evidence. But if you go into some bigger, wider narrative saying that there's a globalist depopulation plan, there's a satanic deep state, Pfizer is working for them, then I think it will become a conspiracy theory, because I think it's something you can feel, right? Because it's not healthy skepticism, but it goes far beyond from healthy skepticism and get into a territory that, there are shadows. You talk about shadows. You talk about things that can't be verified by evidence or common sense. And so then it will become a conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories create movements. Healthy skepticism is, of course, I can think, think about whether these vaccines developed pretty early with limited time frames. So what would happen if I get it, and whether I will get side effects? These are, I think, healthy skepticism. People think about these things every day, whether I will get sick, whether I will get fever or whatever. These are not conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theories are movements. Those are mechanisms. Those work behind, healthy skepticism and distort the reality. That's how I can explain it.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So, as a journalist, that's one of the most useful definitions, because we are skeptical of everything, right? We trust nothing. We always ask questions, and we tend not to believe people or organizations that have lots of power until we manage to find the evidence that what they're saying is indeed correct. But yes, it's not. Our questioning is not framed by a worldview that assumes certain things, or that sees a grand plan, or that, you know, is shaped by the perspective of a movement. And I'd love to talk more about that, because you've done some really interesting research on those movements. But I wanted to come to Jon now and ask maybe a similar question, but slant it slightly differently, which is, because Chamila has given us a very nice definition in a sense. So if you wanted to add to that, or reflect on that, that'd be great. But also, why do so many people believe conspiracy theories? It's obviously a pressing question.
Thank you, Mary. I think one thing that I might want to add is, I think skepticism, as you say, Mary, about basically anything is good, and especially because this is a point of someone's concern, right? COVID for everyone, because it affects pretty much everyone on the planet, and there are a lot of powerful companies and organizations, etc., involved that don't always have a completely stellar reputation. So yes, it is reasonable to be skeptical, but what is not reasonable is if this skepticism is completely immutable. So if you are presented with some kind of evidence that, you know, your theory, your skepticism isn't completely warranted, the reasonable thing to do is to then adapt your opinion in some regard. What is not reasonable is to continue to believe that something must be wrong, regardless of how much evidence you're presented with. So that's, I think, where I would sort of draw the line between healthy skepticism and basically falling into conspiracism, if you will. And why are conspiracy theories so popular? Well, some of it is not completely harmless fun, but something akin to it, like speculating about the moon landing being faked, for example, isn't necessarily harmful in and of itself, right? It can be fun to do, like when we used to have pubs and sit there, right? It's speculation, it's sort of theorizing, it's coming up with like interesting stories about things that may have happened and so on. So there's an interest there, sort of, it tickles our imagination almost. But it's of course very difficult to separate harmless from harmful conspiracy theory. And particularly in the context of COVID, what makes these conspiracy theories popular is, number one, COVID affects everyone, as I just said. Number two, because it affects everyone, a conspiracy theory emerging in Sweden, let's say, can go viral in Argentina because they're both dealing with the same problem, right? And also there is very much an emotional aspect to it, right? People know people who are getting ill, maybe their lives are affected, their mental health might be affected, et cetera, all of which the economy is doing worse, which always matters a lot, all of which creates an environment for conspiracy theories to thrive.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to touch a bit more on that in a moment and think about how we deal with some of those things. But another question that's come up quite a lot that I think we put to Tim based on what he said at the beginning. Alison Crowther has asked, what guidance can you give for individuals who would like to gently challenge family and friends who are gripped by conspiracy? And Ivor Wells in the chat has asked something similar, which is sometimes just saying, I'm doing it, I trust the science, isn't enough to convince people. So what advice do you have for people who are concerned about others and want to be persuasive?
Thank you. This is a very important part because family is, close to all of us. We have personal relationship. We don't want to offend our friends and family with, opposite, the way we see things. So here, my advice is to listen actively, right? Because often they have questions. We talk about what is healthy skepticism. Healthy skepticism is basically having questions. And I think it's trying to find out what are actually the questions behind a position. Actually myself asked me, is the vaccine safe? Why was it developed so fast? Just within 1 year. So it's really, finding out. And I started, explaining her the facts and the science behind that. But basically then through the listening in question, I found out because, she's been, on a WhatsApp group with a group of friends from her church, who was then, sending her messages, videos, what they found about what people are talking. So she was confused in terms of, what close friends would tell her, and then what her husband would tell her. So I think this is really important that we get to the ground from friends and family, where their positions coming from. Often it's not the science, it's something that is deeper rooted, a mistrust to certain institutions. We see a lot of science, for example, coming from the US, that certain vulnerable population, historically didn't have access to health services because of the cost, because of the infrastructure. So there is already a mistrust towards these institutions. And then you will see then, when now suddenly, we have to take a COVID vaccine, then this is just being amplified by the mistrust that was already existing before that. So it's not necessarily the vaccine, but it's the mistrust into the condition that already existed in the health system, in that society, in that community. And this is where now I'm coming from, within friends and family. Have an honest discussion, listen actively, find out where they're coming from, and providing them also in the discussion a way out, a compassionate and empathical way of hearing. I hear you, I understand, oh, that's very interesting. By the way, I have this friend who said this, and it's interesting though that, we have this two different perspectives. I fully understand, but, personally, I can only tell you what I know and feel, and this is this and this. So it's this compassionate within the family, this person, connection that already exists. You probably talk differently than to friends and family when you talk to a stranger. And I think that's, we have to learn that there are different ways, but the first thing is to actively listen and get to the ground where these questions are actually rooted and coming from.
Thank you. Yeah, and to surface one of those questions, someone in the chat, Anthony Matthews, said, how do we respond to those who point to the fact, quote, fact, that vaccine manufacturers can't be sued? Right, so that's an interesting example of, I actually don't know whether or not this is correct, so you can tell me that, but where a fact is used to imply something which sows mistrust. That would be a great example, because that's classic misinfo, isn't it? And great to hear more from you on that one particularly.
Thank you. I think that's just a bold statement to put out there, but actually manufacturers have to comply to good manufacturing procedures. That they, in their manufacturing capacity, they have put standards in place that, in the production of the vaccine, that they don't do mistakes. And sometimes, if a vial breaks and then, a small piece of a glass is within something, or it's because of the process, something might happen. But in these cases, there are legal frameworks, to go against that. So it's a given fact. And the safety of the vaccine has been established by the medical regulatory agency, really of reviewing the process of how the vaccine has been developed. So that blunt statement is not correct, and one need to point out to the facts where that is actually written and actually it can be looked at.
Thank you. So the answer is there are legal consequences for manufacturers who don't follow safety procedures, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the talking point there, which is again very useful. I wanted to come to you again, Chamila, because your specialism is kind of far right terrorism, political violence, and there's a lot of interest in the sort of overlap between the kind of anti-vaxxer movements and other kind of extreme or extremist groups, ideologies, beliefs, and I guess what have you observed in the kind of overlap of these different kind of narratives and movements and groups, and what can we learn from that?
when we look into what really lies behind the fear of vaccines, it's clear that these fears are not only coming from just random thoughts and speculations. Instead, there are thought movements with many belief systems and established conspiracy theories that support and maintain vaccine skepticism. In that context, it's a mixed picture. Is there a link between anti-vax movements and the far right? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The far right opposes vaccines to discredit struggling democracies amidst a deadly pandemic. Populists oppose vaccines because they are suspicious of establishment and elites. The idea of corrupt establishment against ordinary masses mindset. Then anti-vaxxers discredit government, big pharma, corporations, and healthcare system. Conspiracy theorists have their own countless reasons for vaccine skepticism. At the same time, authoritarian regimes trying to spread vaccine lies to confuse people and discredit democracies. So all these elements do this for various reasons. However, they all are in one platform when it comes to their meta-political assault to delegitimize democracies. Meta-political assault means trying to discredit the current establishment, which is happened to be a liberal democracy. They're not happy about the existing establishment one way or another. I mean, all these elements. There can be occasional far-right links to anti-vaxxers, and sometimes these movements can be separate. But the point is that they unite in a single platform in their hostility towards vaccination and try to discredit democracies and key institutions behind the vaccination rollout. We cannot say all anti-vaxxers are far-right, but anti-vaxxers are against the establishment fundamentally. These are beliefs that can be easily found. There are many beliefs and ideas. They can overlap and sometimes they are separate, but mostly these elements are kind of anti-establishment. They, one way or another, they try to discredit the establishment.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a very common theme I picked up. I spent a lot of time in the United States since late October, speaking to voters, American voters in the Midwest and in the South in Georgia during the runoff election. And that was obviously a very common theme which ran through a lot of the discourse. A lot of people I spoke to who were Trump supporters, who were protesting against, stop the steal of the election and all the rest. And they said things, many of them said things I have a lot of sympathy with about the way that their communities had been excluded or marginalized, about the way that institutions had not earned their trust and their faith and had failed them. They cited issues such as the Iraq War and other problems, other big failings of political and moral leadership, for their skepticism, which had kind of developed into conspiracy theories around COVID denialism, around the false claims about the stolen election in the US. And I was noticing today that a Republican congresswoman from Georgia has been censured, but she's a former QAnon supporter and has spread conspiracy theories. And of course, the really important and salient point there is this congresswoman and so many others like her have a platform which amplifies this misinformation. There are large private technology companies that are making extraordinary amounts of money through algorithms which amplify misinformation. And it seems to me as though the issue is not necessarily the Republican congresswoman, whether or not she should sit on committees, which is obviously a question for lawmakers and politics, but why does she have such a megaphone? And we've spoken about this a lot, Jon, you and I, and you've tried to come up with some potential solutions to this. But first of all, just, I mean, one person here asked as well, you know, is Twitter doing enough to mitigate vaccine misinformation on their platform? I'd sort of make the question broader about social media and what should be done, what needs to be done, what can we learn?
Lots of very interesting questions, right? Like, I think you make a very good point that if you want to build trust in institutions as an institution, you have to earn that trust. I think that makes a lot of sense, right? So the WHO, if it wants to be seen as a legitimate conveyor of information about vaccines, it should be a legitimate conveyor of information about vaccines, which to my best knowledge, it more or less is, which is good, right? But I feel that large institutions every once in a while underestimate the impact of a single, not necessarily mistake, but error of judgment. For example, recommending something like recommending against mask wearing at a certain time. If it later turns out that masks are effective, right, then that recommendation looks bad, and it fuels, or it adds fuel to the fire for conspiracy theorists to later say, look, the WHO was wrong then, that means they are also wrong now, right? So ideally what you want to avoid is to be wrong altogether, which is impossible, but it is good to be cognizant of the consequences of being wrong. When it comes to solutions, I think a lot of people here in this conversation may have seen the document on Netflix called Social Dilemma, which you also, I think, alluded to, Mary, which essentially argues that because social media companies make money by selling advertisements, and you can sell advertisements for more money if you can prove that people engage more with your ads, like social media users. That means that your algorithms are basically geared towards maximizing engagement in some way. And unfortunately, what engages us on social media is also quite likely to be the type of content that we might consider to be harmful at a societal scale. For example, because it's fake, or because it incites violence, or because it fuels political polarization, etc. So that might mean that some of the solutions that we might have to think about when it comes to social media and how algorithms basically rank the stuff that shows up on our feeds, it might be worth thinking about this aspect as well, right? Let's say we know, for example, that tobacco is harmful, right? But we don't prohibit it, but we do not market it to children. Same with a variety of other things, right? So we as a society have decided, okay, we don't think that this is bad enough to ban it, like heroin, say, but it is bad enough that we impose limits on how a product can be sold and in what way. So this is one of these questions that we can think about in terms of solutions. But what my research has more focused on, at least in recent years, is, okay, how can we improve someone's ability to spot what it looks like to be misled, right? What the manipulation tactics are that underlie misinformation sort of in a general sense, and how can you make people more aware of these strategies and techniques without forcing them and without putting them off, because I am an academic at the University of Cambridge. We have a reputation of being ivory tower posh boys effectively, and rightfully so to a degree. So me going out and telling people what to believe is going to backfire tremendously, and rightfully so. So in that sense, what we prefer is to be aware that people might not be all that interested in learning through an information sheet or a couple of boring links on a web page, let's say. So that's why we created a series of entertaining games, for example, where we basically encourage people to act as the bad guy almost. Meaning, you know what, why don't you go spread misinformation in a safe environment for a little while to figure out how it works sort of from the inside. And then my research focuses on what that does in terms of your ability to spot misinformation in the future.
Thank you. I want to come back to that more and in more detail. But Chamila, you had a hand up, so I wanted you to come in and respond to this as well.
Yes, I want to a little bit talk about the structures behind vaccine skepticism. because skepticism is not a rootless phenomenon, but rather an outcome of a well-reasoned alternative reality. If we just to get into the bigger picture, if we categorize the main thought movements behind vaccine skepticism, some are authoritarian elements, such as far-right. They are naturally skeptical about vaccines to discredit democracies. Some are wary of vaccines as they believe that it's planned by big pharma and big corporations to make profit. Some fear vaccines as they have lost trust in government, healthcare system, pharmaceutical companies, and corporations. 99% of we the people against 1% of elite is the mindset behind this idea. Some others are wary of vaccines because they believe that it's a planned plot by a satanic deep state. They would say pandemic is not real, it's pandemic. A coming tyranny will insert you microchips, so you would become like a computer interface and can be manipulated easily. Some other people also hold on to messianic and millenarian beliefs, reasoning that vaccines are part of a sinister plot against humanity. These elements would say that these types of things must happen before they are anticipated biblical events. Some have alternative narratives based on many conspiracy theories, such as 5G, Great Reset, depopulation plan. And again, some fear vaccines and they have concerns of their side effects. I think it's a reasonable concern and it's a healthy skepticism. These are the beliefs that can be easily found, and some ideas are brief, but there are wider belief systems, worldviews. These thought movements form an underlying structure that feeds vaccine fears. I think we can't talk about vaccine fears without thinking about these streams that feed these worldviews, belief systems, ideas to confuse people and, to make people worry about various things. So I think we have to understand there is a structure, there is a mechanism, there are worldviews, there are belief systems behind this, and they are bombarding societies with these, ideas. So many people can be really affected by these ideas. There are healthy skepticism. I think it's very, very important, but there are these thought movements that bombard societies also.
Sorry, I was on mute there. I thank you, Chamila. I wanted to come back to Tim and again, so you've outlined the ways in which we can address some of these issues, and you've talked about some of the facts and the questions that people might have. What are you dealing with now? I mean, what are the things that worry you most and that are the biggest challenges in your role? And yeah, paint the picture of, I guess, what worries you, what's in the front of your desk every day, and how you're trying to tackle those problems.
I think what worries me most, just to build on what Chamila said, is we're losing the people that are undecided. These are the swing voters. Let's see that. There's a really nice publication in Nature, published by Neil Johnson from Georgetown University. And he looked at one day on Facebook, 100 million users and their attitude towards vaccine. And what he showed, the connection between these 100 million people and the groups where they are meeting on Facebook. And basically more than 80% of these 100 million users are undecided, are neither against or for a vaccine. The smaller minority are those that are opposing a vaccine. And then the group in between are those are pro-vaccine. And when you see at the connection, there is an interesting map he shows that the people that are against a vaccine are better connected to the undecided. For example, you are in a pizza lover group. So in the pizza lover group, you have people that are against vaccine, and then the majority is undecided. So they have a better outreach, better connection. And his map just shows how the red dots, the bad actors, so-called, are reaching the more than 80% undecided better than the ones that are pro-vaccine. And this is what worries me, that we are focusing too much on the small minority, which is hard to persuade because they're living in their own world, and we're living and losing the undecided one, the ones that still have questions, that are still worried, but they are willing to talk and understand. And we're not reaching them with our connections, with our messages, because maybe let's say, if we consider us the good guys, we are living in a bubble. I think I just realized for myself that in my group of friends and colleagues, I don't know anybody who is a COVID denier. I live in my bubble with my friends and colleagues and the people I have outreach with. I don't really know somebody in this other world, and the question then, how to reach them. And I think this is where I need to find solution to understand what can I do from a public health point of view to reach those undecided, and what mechanism do I need to put in place. Of course, and this cannot be a top-down approach where I just push out information guidance and expect people to go to the WHO website and find it. We need to find new ways so people reach and find information. One of the key actions WHO did is we tried to partner with Google, with Facebook, so the good information can be found when you search COVID in the search bar, that certain information is then on top. Same collaboration we have with other platforms, so people find this information. But I think we can do more, and we must do more with different forms of how we communicate. We have to rethink the way we communicate science. I think at one point in the pandemic, there was a very popular GIF called Flatten the Curve. Really something really summarizing what we have to do in terms of wearing a mask, keep a distance. The combination of this will flatten the curve, so we will win time and don't overburden our health system. That's a very complex thing to communicate on a scientific level, but somebody created a GIF around this to demonstrate this. And I saw this all over the place. People who probably never talk about pandemic preparedness, using this GIF to communicate to each other, why do we have to do this now, and what impact it will have. And that was science at its best.
Thank you so much. You preempted my next question, which is give us an example of something good that's worked. And I wanted to come to Jon again, because Jon, we've talked about inoculation. I've spoken with a lot of academics and researchers about inoculation. Could you talk a bit more about, and that sounds scientific when it's partly scientific, but it's sort of not as well. To talk a bit more about the work that you've done on that, and what you think is most effective. What initiatives you've seen, whether it's yours or others, what initiatives you've seen that you think have most promise. So explain what we commonly mean by inoculation against misinformation, and then into some stuff that you think is most interesting in this space and most viable.
Yeah, sort of. Following up on what Tim was saying, like one thing is persuading people of what you call the right information, let's say, right? But that's extremely difficult. There's a reason so many people are undecided. Part of it is they do not care. So what we really try to focus on, at least in our research, is not necessarily persuading people, but preventing unwanted persuasion for bad reasons, right? Which kind of neatly avoids the issue of telling people what to think, especially if you prevent unwanted persuasion where you can be reasonably sure that it is simply misinformation, that you have a very good justification to want to prevent people from falling for it, right? So when it comes to vaccine hesitancy, for example, if you hear about vaccines and you hear they don't work very well for people who are immunocompromised in some regard, which is reasonable. And it prompts hearing this information prompts you to go do a test because you think, well, actually, autoimmune disease runs in my family. I should probably get tested. And it turns out that you have an undiagnosed autoimmune disease. Let's say this is a hypothetical, right? And therefore you think, okay, maybe I should take caution when it comes to vaccinations because I have a disease that might negatively affect this. That's fair enough, I would say. What's not fair enough is if someone reads on the internet that vaccines give you autism, which they don't, and therefore decides, okay, well, that means I'm not getting vaccinated then, or I'm no longer vaccinating my kids because I don't want to get autism. But that's where you can say, okay, well, this type of persuasion is unwanted. And that is where we should sort of try to intervene early, meaning raise people's defenses against that type of persuasion before they are exposed to it. And that is sort of where the idea of psychological inoculations come from, meaning it works pretty much like a real vaccine. You preemptively expose people to a weakened dose of the misinformation or the informational virus. And in theory, that prompts people to think about counter-arguments against this type of misinformation. And once they've already gone through the process of counter-arguing against the misinformation, when you then expose them to the real fake news or the real misinformation, they already have the counter-arguments in place to argue against it and therefore have a reduced chance of being persuaded by it. So this framework is quite old, from 1960s or so. And it's sort of seen a revival in recent years, especially within the context of misinformation.
So yeah, give us an example of how that works in practice. So like walk us through how that would actually work on a subject or an issue.
So it can be in, like the medium, the metaphorical syringe, let's say, the psychological inoculation doesn't really matter, but essentially it's a messaging strategy, right? So I know, for example, that you, Mary, next week are going to be listening to some crank who's going to be talking about vaccines. And I know this crank and I know what this crank's going to say approximately. So before you go there, you and I sit down and I talk you through all the things that I think this crank is going to tell you. And I already refute them for you sort of ahead of time, right? Then if you then listen to said crank, you are less likely to be persuaded than if I hadn't sat down with you and talked you through all of the reasons why this crank is wrong.
Okay, but then the question is, how does that work in practice, right? Because in theory, yes, I mean, so other people have written me through versions of this, which is like, you know, one way to inoculate people is to say, I'm not telling you what to think, but if someone tells you X or Y or Z, you might want to ask X or Y or Z, right? So, you know, you're preempting what people are going to say, and if people are if that gets predicted, right? So I'm not telling you what to think, but if someone tells you that vaccines cause autism, you know, you might want to ask them, you know, where they heard that, or, you know, if they then say vaccines cause autism and something else, you know, you're preparing people to question that, right? But how does that work? How does that like delivery system work, right? Because you can't always predict that. That's not a real, that's a theoretical thing, right? That's not a real world example.
Yeah, well, in some cases it's relatively easy, right? Because we know in some domains what type of narratives or what specific pieces of misinformation are likely to make the rounds, right? Which makes our job a lot easier, but often you don't. So that's why we instead don't really focus on individual examples of misinformation, but rather what it looks like. So for example, when it comes to vaccine hesitancy, a significant proportion of misinformation about vaccines is basically emotional amplification. So it is true that vaccines have side effects, the vast majority of which are mild, right? But in very, very rare cases, they can cause an extreme reaction, often due to an undiagnosed immunocompromisation, if you will. But if at a scale of billions of people receiving vaccines, you can point to a real example where that happened, right? But if you completely ignore how tiny that chance is of that happening, and instead only zoom in on this one particular terrifying, horrific, horrible case of a child getting more ill from a vaccine, let's say, and you describe this whole child's life story, the mother's life story, the father's life story, et cetera, and you emphasize this, the tragedy of it, that is a persuasion strategy that can actually be pretty persuasive in terms of altering people's attitudes towards vaccines. But if ahead of time you warn people, look, individual cases are a very different thing from like bigger level statistics. So be wary of anyone who tries to single out individual cases of bad things happening and refuses to talk to you about like the actual chance of something like that happening. Right? So that's the strategy that you're inoculating people against, rather than I already know the case of this one child from India, let's say, that became ill, right? Because that's impossible to do at a large scale.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And we are almost out of time here. I wanted to ask Tim one more question, and thanks to everyone who's participated, because there's been some fantastic commentary which I'd really encourage people to look at as well. Katya said something fascinating about, believers in conspiracy theories are more active than rational information users. The active point, right? They have strong intrinsic motivation to join undecided groups and share their beliefs. And information that only appeals to reason doesn't have that same kind of cadre of passionate activists, which I think is a really, really important reflection. Tim, looking ahead, I mean, so you're concerned about your filter bubble, which technology sort of amplifies and builds around you, and your life and work and everything amplifies and builds around you. Looking ahead to the next year, what do you see happening? And I don't mean what are you worried about, but sort of how do you see this playing out? And I dare to use the word post-COVID, right? But, how do you think this experience is going to shape our understanding of conspiracy theories, reality, misinformation? Like, how does this change the game longer term, do you think?
That's a big question. I don't have a crystal ball to look into. I only feel that I think this whole point about misinformation, social media, it didn't only start with the pandemic, right? You had elections, topics on this, before, so it's not new. But I think what's is important is now we all were somehow touched by it. I think John said it, this is a global event. We've seen real life harm from misinformation. We've seen in Iran people drinking methanol and dying because somebody said, hey, it can cure you or kill the virus. So there is real harm from misinformation. I think the key harm that have been alluded to is the mistrust in government and public health institution, but also our society, the cohesion of society, is being affected by this. So I think there will be a lot of lessons learned and understanding how we have to react and respond to this phenomenon in the future. We at WHO are getting now prepared in terms of developing new tools to understand social digital listening. We just launched this week a new platform that is called EARS, Early AI Response for Social Listening, to build a tool for countries to see the digital conversation, understand, are people asking questions or are people complaining about an issue in different narratives. So there can be a monitoring of the emotions of the questions people have in order to guide public health then what the kind of information there is that we need to fill. John talked about social inoculation. This is very much what I talked earlier about filling information voids, so that there's enough information out there that the population is immunized with good information. The key is here now, how do we measure that when we push out information that it had an impact? So for example, at WHO, we have been now testing something around really social listening for the last 52 weeks, where we created like a report to see what are the issues people are looking for and how can we preemptively fill the information void. So for example, and we looked at it in April, there was an issue around COVID-19 immunity. We saw a rise in this narrative and people are interested in this, we did then an intervention, which was a double press conference, and then also updating and sharing a double guidance on this topic. And then 1-2 weeks later, we saw a drop in the conversation. So we hope, and we need to do more research around this, how understanding rising narratives and doing the right information intervention at one point can also change a certain narrative on the digital front. So this is the key, I think, for us in the future. How can we measure this phenomenon? And we can measure also the interventions we do to give people the right information so that not the bad actors fill this information void.
Thank you so much. Very briefly to our other panelists. Crystal ball, how is this going to change us? Chamila, just very briefly, what do you think are going to be some of the long-lasting consequences, learnings, effects of this? And
I genuinely fear whether the disinformation landscape is too big to fail when looking into 8con, 4chan, and especially I found amazing thing. I want to tell the story. To understand how countless belief systems unite in one platform, you must look into the Great Awakening map. This can be found easily on the internet. QAnon is just one step within this wider plan of Great Awakening. Someone somehow has done a highly creative task, putting countless ideologies, belief systems, conspiracies, and pure imagination together to craft a broad alternative reality. So, if you look into the Great Awakening map, this is a very strong alternative reality, as it has the ability to unite countless interests, values, beliefs, ideas, and conspiracies that used to exist in societies into one platform against current system or existing political system. Even your harmless next door neighbor who used to be a conspiracy theorist now finds his place in the wider narrative where he thinks he's a fighter who reveals sinister plot of a deep state, such as vaccination and pandemic aimed at depopulation. So this can be a larger than life role for some people. So there are worldviews, there are huge belief systems that are coming together to confuse people and indoctrinate people. Then again, we can see that authoritarian regimes jump on the bandwagon to say that vaccines will turn people into chimpanzees. These are the disinformation mechanisms that are at work. So you could imagine that when there are these types of all-out disinformation campaign against democracies, and there are critical and essential policies such as vaccine rollout, vaccine skepticism is unavoidable. So I genuinely fear that whether it's too big to fail, disinformation, whether it's too big to fail, I just fear.
Gosh, so that's the very bleak crystal ball of one disinformation system to rule them all, that will be with us forever. Jon, crystal ball, can we have some more positive or hopeful predictions at this to close us out? You don't have to be positive or hopeful if you don't feel.
I don't. No, I think I'm actually seeing quite a few positive initiatives that I think are going in the right direction. Let's put it that way. The one thing that I'm skeptical about is our ability to separate, or at least identify where it is useful to cut into people's profits, right? As the thing that I discussed at the beginning, maybe some of the most acceptable solutions lose Facebook, Google, and Twitter a whole bunch of money. That's possible. I don't know, and I'm not saying that, but that's a possibility. And if that turns out to be the case, then we will have to think about what that means, right? Not just for Mark Zuckerberg, but in terms of how we regulate our online space, also bearing in mind the very important issue of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. and not actually accidentally making the situation worse, right? And opening up the way for censorship or very, very bad sort of situations in that regard. But all that being said, I do think that it is positive, for example, that Twitter did a pre-bunking campaign recently ahead of the 2020 US elections. I thought that was useful. I don't know how well it worked. I'd love to see their data, but I thought it was a good idea. And I think actually like the significant amount of time that we spend here talking about things like psychological inoculation, which is kind of my hobby horse, that's obviously good, I think. So in that sense, I do think that there is a movement towards more sort of rigorously empirical research being used directly by policymakers and social media executives, et cetera, to combat this problem. So it's being taken seriously, and the approach to it is also very much scientific, which I very much support.
Thank you. Well, you were able to conjure a few threads of hope in that vision. I think really interestingly, what you're talking about here is the thread that's run all through this, which is it's about power. You know, you said, yes, Twitter have done some good stuff. You know, they did some good stuff pre-US election. But the question is who decides, right? Who are the gatekeepers? You know, should it be Twitter and Facebook? Whether or not they're acting responsibly or irresponsibly, you know, should the power of the public square be held in the hands of these vast, very unaccountable public firms and private firms, or you know, should it be done differently, more democratically? Should regulation seek to serve people in a different way? And I think that's a really fundamental question, because when all the misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories we've been talking about reflect power and powerlessness, right? People who feel powerless against a system or an elite. So I think that touches very nicely that this is a conversation, as so many of these Open Democracy Weekly conversations are, about power and who holds it and who holds power accountable. So I think that's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much to all my panelists. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, John. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Do sign up to our weekly newsletter and join us for our events. They always happen at this time every week. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And if you think independent media needs supporting, please consider making a donation. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to everyone who joined us all over the world, and have a wonderful rest of your day.